And greetings, everyone. I'm Mar. Once again, this is my opinion. As you can tell from the title up there, it is time for another movie review. This is a movie I saw a couple days ago, and it's one that I was actually looking forward to, which, given the nature of the genre it occupies within the last couple of years, is saying something, because even though I grew up as a horror fan, new film-wise, there hasn't really been a lot in the last decade I've actually wanted to go out of my way to see. I think the last couple of years, the only new one has been the Terrifier films, and before that, it's me watching ones that I grew up on in theaters, or looking into ones that I've been meaning to look into from ages gone past. But with this one, I came across a scene from one of the trailers on TikTok randomly. I liked what I saw just from what it seemed to be, so I went to YouTube, watched the trailer, and I'm like, I need to see this one. This, of course, is the Canadian experimental slasher film written and directed by Chris Nash, and looking at it, you can tell it owes a lot to the Friday the 13th series. This, of course, is in a violent nature. Now, before I get too far away from me mentioning that, this is probably the closest we are going to get to having a new Friday the 13th film that's not a fan film, because of the whole nature of the lawsuit with Victor Miller and all that, which I don't want to bog that down here, but let's just say, to shorthand it, I get why he filed the lawsuit, but I do think it is still a BS thing for him to have done, especially since it's basically him giving the finger to his fans, even though it is him going after the whole thing for monetary reasons. But it just does the fandom dirty, especially what I've heard about how he actually came to write the screenplay. But going back into this one, even though this film is essentially at its core like, we have Jason at home, and I'm not the only one who feels that. Like, if you go to the TikTok of all the different video, all the different footages, go to the trailers, there's a lot of jokes about that. You know, like Monday the 15th and stuff like that. Even with that, this film, I'd say, is pretty good, and it was that critical response that I saw when I was researching the film before I saw it that made me go like, really? Because for the most part, slasher films usually get by critics, unless it's ones that really do enjoy horror, or there's something about the film that you can see critics like. Like, for example, bring it up, Friday the 13th Part 6. Just the humor, the self-aware tongue-in-cheekness of that film is why a lot of critics like it. I mean, that can be summed up with the Gravedigger character. Why they have to go and dig up Jason? Some folks around here got a strange idea of entertainment. And of course, Scream 1, because that one is more a very self-aware one. It's stuff like that in the slasher genre that makes critics like it. This one, it's the experimental nature of it, and that is that there is, until we get to the credits, no soundtrack. It's all the ambient noises of nature, which does feel a bit weird, but considering that for the most part we are following the killer, which was the main selling point in watching this film when I saw the footage originally, because I'm like, in most slasher films we jump back and forth. Like, for the most part we'll follow the characters. Occasionally we might get like a point of view shot of the killer, or we might be following him a little bit, but this is a little bit more interesting. While it's not like a found footage or a point of view one where we literally are always in point of view mode, we're following from behind the killer, so we are getting a little bit of that voyeurism that we usually would get from the point of view shots without having a point of view shot. We're like an uninvolved third party watching it from the view that the killer would, just a little bit more back and with a little bit more higher ground. Now, there are moments where that isn't the case, where it cuts further back, and then at the end we completely move away from the character. And it might seem a little artsy to some people, but I enjoyed this. Now, there are a couple moments where it pulls back, where I'm like, okay, it does take away from it, but considering what they're going for, I see why Nash filmed it that way, and ultimately I do feel it works. It's just me personally, if I was in Nash's shoes, I might not have filmed it that way, but that's just me, and that'd be like more a conversation thing, and looking at the script like, okay, given the nature of this, what works best? So I can't really fault Nash for that. Now, given that this is a slasher film, there are going to be kill scenes, and some of them are tame, but a lot of them are very gratuitous. Like, if you can imagine some of your favorite kills in 80s slasher films, they do that. There's a lot of gore, and some of them are very over the top. So in that regard, you have to think more Jason and Michael and less Freddy, because there's not really much supernatural elements other than the fact that he is an unstoppable killer. Now, so far, the only person in the film that actually does deserve to die is the first person, which if you've ever seen the trailers, it is that guy in the house who he walks out with the rifle. That guy really deserved it. I'd say more for his poaching and the fact he's being an a-hole to the uniform people, which is like, really, dude, if you're that much of a jerk when it comes to it, when he knows you're doing this stuff wrong and you know it, and you're getting that defensive, yeah, you deserve it. Now, when it comes to him getting all defensive when Johnny walks into his house, which that's the killer's name, by the way, Johnny, I get that. But on other stuff, especially since we see that he has set a trap and poached something and didn't even have the decency to put it out of its misery himself and take it out of the trap, yeah, he deserved it. Everyone else, though, it depends on how you look at it, whether they deserved to die or not. Now, from Johnny's perspective, they did, but that's Johnny's perspective. Us looking at it as the uninvolved third party that's following Johnny, probably not. But again, that's the other interesting thing about this one. Now, there is the joke in slasher films that a lot of the characters are underdeveloped, and that's with us following the traditional film format. Here, they're only as developed as we would see from Johnny's perspective on the matter, from how Johnny sees the characters from a distance, which is an interesting take because majority of the time, a slasher killer's victims are just people he runs into by chance. I think there are exceptions to it, like Scream, obviously, because of all the motivations of the killers, depending on which instance we're talking about. And of course, until we get to probably part 5, I would say, with Freddy. All a main reason. But then again, that might only apply to 5 and 6. And that'd only be a couple of the victims from 6. And the rest of it, you really see what his motivation is there. Here, totally by chance, the only one that's really connected to Johnny, as we find out, is the Ranger character, and that's part of Johnny's backstory. But everyone else he just runs into by chance after he's resurrected. But of course, considering what revived him and what his goal is, it is not fully chance. I mean, the only victims of his that he runs into by chance are the yoga girls. Now, and get back into the kills and all that. I mean, how he kills the guy in the house, deservedly so. The first victim of his main ones he kills definitely feels like a tribute to Jason's kills, like how he killed Crazy Ralph, but instead of garroting him, it's like a blade thing through his mouth. When I saw him, like, ooh, at first I'm like, what's he doing? I'm like, oh, blade. Ooh, that's gonna hurt. Oh, he's dead. And then, of course, the yoga girls. One of them, this is where we get a tame death, and that, of course, is the drowning one. Which, this is definitely a Friday the 13th one. It just seems like a lot of the movies that are like close to the lake, there's always at least one death that involves the lake in some regard. This is more so like in the mid-films, because part 2, there's one adjacent to the lake, but not directly in it. Part 3, of course, I think it's mainly the jump scare. And then, of course, him shooting the one girl by the lake. Part 4, it's the first one where he actually comes out of the water and kills somebody. Part 5, it's a copycat's a little different. Part 6, of course, the whole ending. Part 7, there's a lot of stuff in there. And then, of course, part 8, he's constantly coming out of the water, so there's that. But we never really see, other than part 6 at the end, how he gets into the lake for the surprise. Here, of course, we see Johnny get into the lake, and with how it's filmed from afar, the whole scene, the tension is building as we're wondering, okay, when's Johnny going to attack? And, of course, once the other girl leaves, and then she's sitting there, it's like, going to be any moment, how gruesome is it going to be? Then we see her react like she's being attacked or being pulled down. She's pulled down, she's dead, she comes up to the surface all dead, and then Johnny exits the water. And then, of course, when he gets to the other victim, she could have potentially got away but then hurt herself, but then Johnny probably would have followed her down and killed her another way. So her just standing there accepting her fate. And it's definitely one of those kills that's set up this way to be for the audience to go like, what a stupid person. And then, of course, her death. This is one of the most gratuitous moments in the film. And if it wasn't for some of the Terrifier scenes, I'd say this is probably the most gratuitous death scene in a slasher film in years. And the best thing I can compare it to is if you imagine a certain scene from Mutilator. It's that gruesome, but it's not the same type of thing. Whereas that one, it's involving a hook going to a female's. This one, it's just how violent, all the crunching sounds and all the blood you see. I think without the music, you really hear the crunch scenes, which really adds to the visceral nature of this kill. And just how he bends her spine over and then shoves it through her chest backwards. It's like, oh! And of course, the whole time you're watching, you're like, okay, she's already dead. And he's really going over the top with it in his anger. So that really ties into the name of the film, and a violent nature. And then, of course, there's a couple other deaths later on with the kids that definitely echo Jason a bit more, like him throwing a hatchet, killing somebody. And then with how violent he gets with the boyfriend, that really seems personal. The one that it kind of reminds me of is in part 3, where Jason kills the one biker character at the end with how much he's going. The only difference is Johnny really goes at him because at that point it's really personal. And then, of course, with how the Ranger gets killed, that is definitely the most unique kill in the whole film because of what it involves, and that is a log splitter, which essentially imagine like an axe head on a machine that presses it forward, or at least that's how the design of this one is. And the fact that this film also employs long takes, which if you don't know what a long take is, it's where the camera is in place for a long time and without cutting to another angle and back and forth, it holds it. If you've ever watched any of Tarantino's films, you'll have a good example because he loved to employ the long take. And I do love long takes as well. And it can add to it. In this one, if you're expecting like a typical slasher film, it might be like you're channeling your inner Monty Python and you're like, yes, get on with it. But I just love the tension of it, especially since at that point the Ranger is paralyzed, so he cannot do anything. If this was a typical slasher film, it'd probably be like a close-up with him as the axe gets closer, seeing the axe in his eye, but just seeing it in that third-person thing, you're like, okay, here it comes, and then when it finally hits you, like, ooh. Now, of course, with it, this is where they show it, but it's also where you can kind of see the film does have a more independent budget, as the film was made for $2.1 million. And I would be lying if I said that there wasn't times where you can tell that. But considering most of the film was out in the woods, it's like some of the Friday the 13th films. So you know they're lower budget, but with how they film it, it doesn't necessarily hurt the film. It's just if you're used to like big old grandiose productions, you're not going to have a good time. Now I've mentioned Johnny and all that stuff about him, but I haven't really talked about the lore behind him. Now, with his lore, you can definitely tell that the Friday the 13th tribute act goes. Because that's the way I look at this film a little bit more. Not necessarily a full-on ripoff, but more a tribute to the slasher films more so Friday the 13th in general. And that is that, and this is a little bit of a spoiler because this comes from the film. And most of this is said in a scene where, you know, kind of reminiscent of Friday the 13th Part 2, the campfire scene, and then other scenes throughout the series where we either restate the lore for those who that might be their first film in the series, or you know, just for exposition. And that is that Johnny, him and his father, they used to live alongside these loggers. His father ran a store where he'd sell stuff to the loggers, you know, toiletries, food, stuff like that. But of course he'd jack up the prices, which of course you can tell they really hated that. But they also hated Johnny because he liked to play around them and all that. And Johnny was a little slow. Now they come out and actually say that he's slow. Whereas with Jason, it's more implied. I think the closest they get to actually saying it in the core films is in Part 2. When Jenny is hypothesizing if there actually was a Jason, what would he be like today. And she calls him a frightened retard. Or a child trapped in a man's body. I think other than that, the only other time they mention it, of course, is Freddy, and of course, frickin' Freddy. Here they don't say the word, but you know, you get it. He is very slow. Now, one night, the loggers essentially set up Johnny, and he ends up dying by falling from a fire station. One of those ones out in the woods, one of those fire towers. He lands on his head and he dies. Now, of course, as you can tell, especially if you know your Jason lore. The remaining dad is not going to like this too much, so he goes to attack them, and he ends up dead. And eventually, most of the loggers end up dead. Now, as the lore states it, all of them did, and nobody knew why, but some people who were nearby happened to see a giant guy wearing one of those forest fighter masks, those old school ones, walking in the vicinity of the campground. And that is what he's wearing. I know a lot of people are saying it looks like a scuba helmet, which it kind of does, and the fact that he wears it when he goes underwater doesn't help matters, but it being an old school fire one definitely makes a lot more sense, especially since it's out in the woods. And it would make a lot more sense to be able to find one of those out in the middle of the woods instead of finding like a random old school diving helmet. Now, as we find out from the ranger, there was one survivor, and that was his dad, and he's the one that put Johnny back in the ground. Now, the way to put Johnny back in the ground is to basically tie him up, put him there, and put his mother's necklace there, because to tie into it, the only thing that was keeping him in the ground was this little pole thing with a necklace on top of it. That was his mother's necklace. It was the only thing of hers he had left. And one of the few moments where we actually hear Johnny's inner monologue, where it's his dad talking, we see that his mother did love him, and that was one of the few things that he had to remember her by. So the fact of the matter that someone would take that from him, especially since it's in his final resting place, he's not going to like that. And that's his motivation, to try to reclaim it. And that's why he's following these punk kids who took it from him. Now, the whole thing about it being his final resting place definitely echoes Part 6 a lot, but it also feels very Revenant-driven, where they're going to be wanting to return to their final resting place, depending on how you look at it. And like Jason, Johnny is definitely a revenant, and, killing people violently. I mean, violent nature is the name of the movie, after all. Keeps following them, and like Jason, unstoppable. Now, there's some tension in a couple of scenes where, like, don't do that, especially that close to him, but like, oh crap, you idiots. Now, the ending of the film seems to confuse some people, and from some of the comments I read, this killed the whole purpose of the film, which it didn't with me, and that's mainly because I felt it fit the tone of the film and what they're going for, and it also ties more into the name of the film, In a Violent Nature. And that is, we have our final girl escape. Now, the way she manages to do this is because her and her boyfriend are setting up the trap to try to kill this guy, or at least incapacitate him enough, of course, so where they can return him to his grave with everything. And he hears them, which I just love the little bit of the humor in there, because you see Johnny stop when we hear it, and he turns, and he's like, oh, I know what you guys are going to do. There's definitely echoes, like how a lot of the final characters in these horror films will try to stop the bad guy, and then either the plan semi-works, but not enough to kill him, or it fails spectacularly. Here, obviously, it fails epically, not spectacularly. And, of course, with some of it, this goes into some of the humor where we get to see, like, how the killer will do stuff. Like, there's an earlier scene where Johnny does the whole honk the horn thing and then walks around the house. And we're following him still, but getting back to the ending. He kills the guy, and the final girl is essentially like, frick this, I'm out. Leaves the gasoline they were going to use for the plan, and she also puts a necklace around it, and then basically nopes out. And with how the rest of the movie plays, you're wondering, okay, is Johnny going to jump out and kill her now? Because that's what we expect in a lot of these slasher films, that the killer is going to keep following her and kill her, and then all that. Now, she manages to get to a road, and is saved by an older woman, of course, played by Lauren Marie Taylor, who, that name doesn't sound familiar off the top of my head, off the top of your head, excuse me. She was in Friday the 13th, Part 2. She wasn't Jenny, she was Vicky, who, if I read the thing right, is the love interest of the guy in the wheelchair. So, one of my favorite of the characters in that one. So here, perfect casting for her to play the woman here. And you can tell she's really wanting to help this girl. And she's asking her what happened, and she just says they were attacked by an animal. She doesn't specify what it is. Now, considering where the film is set, a bear would be the likely answer. Now, the reason I say that is the film never states out wholeheartedly where they're at, but the in-credit song makes it seem like they're up in Toronto or the woods somewhere in that part of Canada. And since it was filmed in that part of Canada, you can expect it's the same thing. It's kind of like with Friday the 13th, where it was filmed in New Jersey. They never specify it's in New Jersey, but there's enough where you can kind of piece it together. I mean, in that one, the character's last name of Voorhees should be a big giveaway, since I guess that was a common name in the history of New Jersey. But getting back to it, the lady, it tells her that, you know, sometimes stuff like this happens, and brings up a story involving her brother, where him being a ranger, he was investigating a lot of attacks that were happening in that area that were being attributed to a bear. Now, the bear would kill like these animals, attack these people, but he wouldn't eat them. He'd just leave them be after they were done, and he'd just walk off. Now, he's tracking the bear at one point from some kills, and he gets into a river. He's trying to follow it. He can't seem to follow it because that's where the trail ends. He gets attacked from behind, and he temporarily is drowned in the river. His fellow ranger manages to revive him, and the bear just disappears after that. Now, the point she's trying to make is that sometimes there is no rhyme or reason for these kills, which definitely is a good little commentary on some of the slasher villains in general. Like, sometimes there could be no rhyme or reason. Now, Freddy, we know there's a rhyme or reason. Jason, the only rhyme or reason is you come into his woods, you're dead. But then, of course, some of the later films, it kind of goes out the window. It might be a little more personal, but for some of the people, it's because they come into his woods, and that's it. Michael, it depends on which continuity you're looking at, but the only rhyme or reason could be him trying to recreate the thrill of his first murder. But other than that, when it's the more random one, who he attacks and why, and when, no rhyme or reason. And there could be some other slasher villains you can bring up in there, but some of them there is a rhyme or reason, like Pinhead, even though that's more psychological horror, if you open the box. But if you're going for a more straight one like this, him there being no rhyme or reason. With Johnny, there is, but it's very situational. Like with the Yoga Girls, there was no rhyme or reason there. They weren't involved with it. They would just happen to be out in his woods when he was up. Everyone else was either connected to his necklace being taken or in his way, like the Ranger. And to go with that, if this is what I was thinking while I was watching this, and me and my friend Tiffany, we went and saw it together. We were even talking about it after the film ended, and this is more or less what we were thinking, that this attack she's talking about was Johnny's previous thing. Now, it doesn't fully mesh with what the Ranger is telling, but that could have been earlier in his rampage, and that could have been a different Ranger that was connected, like the one that saved his life could be someone else or whatnot. But it's one of those things where, like, we gotta look at it as some of the characters being unreliable with their narration, especially since this is like local urban legend type of thing, to where some of it could be true, some of it could be not. But with that being Johnny's previous rampage, it would make a lot of sense. Now, some of it would be like, well, why did the Ranger get away after he was drowned and all that? Well, as we see when Johnny did drown someone earlier in the film, the moment they stopped struggling and appeared to be dead, he stopped his attack and went on to his next prey victim. Now, when he's doing something where it's a more bladed one, of course, depending on how aggressive he's going to be, it's going to depend on how over the top he's going to be. Like with the final guy, he went so over the top because he was directly involved with the theft. Everyone else, it would depend. Like the Ranger did it because of the personal connection and all that. Now, there's always the possibility Johnny wasn't, but it's that ambiguity there. That's why I love sometimes debating film. The way I look at it, that was Johnny's previous rampage. And with how he's in the ground, there's also the possibility he's had multiple rampages. And if that's the case, this is like if you were to watch the Friday the 13th films out of order, like I did. And let's say the first one, let's say you pick up a part 4. You got those two films where he's a killer before that. And you're getting in there and you get in the middle of it, so you don't know a lot of what happened before. And so the first time you see Jason, it says a body on the thing, it's like, you got blah, 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 blah. But this time they got him. Or it's like with Halloween, like me watching part 6, where you have those multiple films of history before, but it's only loosely referenced, so you don't have to worry about it, other than like the general premise, what you're caught up with. Here, if this turns out to just be a one-off, you could just be the one-off talking about it, or if it starts another like loose series, it could also be just like a middle rampage one. They could do a prequel, they could do a sequel, however they want to go with. Now, The little tight thing with this ending thing is that this is an aspect with Final Girls you never really see, and that is what happens way in the aftermath following their interaction. If we see any aftermath, it's usually the initial aftermath, it's over, it's finally over, and then either a jump scare that does a question mark, like the ending of the reboot of Friday the 13th, Jenny being loaded into the ambulance, stuff like that. We never see like too far afterwards. There are a couple exceptions, but it's usually in another film, not within the same film. Like Laurie Strode, depending on what continuity, we see her many years after her interactions with Michael, PTSD and all. And then, of course, in the first Friday the 13th, we see the final girl at the beginning of the second film. We see she's not really fully digesting it, and then, of course, Jason kills her. So she was right to be worried. Here, it's more her. You see the PTSD there, and you start to see her thinking like, okay, what's going to happen? Is Johnny going to come and find me now? Am I going to have to worry the rest of my life and all that? So there is that worrying there, and that's why there's a lot of tension in there. Like up until the credits started, I was wondering like, okay, is Johnny going to appear now? Because with how the previous scene was before it got to the road, where she was running with all the weird camera movements, it made it seem like she was running all the majority of the night. Enough to get away from Johnny, depending how it is, but there's also that thing that no matter how fast the victim runs, the killer always is faster and finds him. So I was wondering if they're going to go that way. And of course, with her being in her state of mind, stuff like that is running through her head too. And all throughout the thing, like not wanting the woman to stop to put the tourniquet on her leg. And I'm wondering like, okay, we're going to see Johnny in the distance or whatnot, but nope. And of course, there's that hint that either he got the necklace and went back to sleep on his own, or he's just still out there just wandering aimlessly, kind of like how Jason was before Friday the 13th Part 2, where his rampage is over. He's now just going to go back to wandering through the woods aimlessly, either until he finds another victim, or now that he has his necklace, he really has no need to unless it's self-defense, like we've seen a couple of the times, like with the guy with the gun, or they kind of say the ranger, and then of course the other loggers. That one's more vengeance / self-defense, but you get what I'm saying there. Now the film is 94 minutes. I thought it went by like that. I mean, the more artsy nature of it kind of makes it feel a little bit longer, but not like too long. Like I've read some of the comments of people saying, "Oh, I fell asleep in there." But if it's with me, I do not understand how you fall asleep in a movie theater when you are younger. Like older, I can kind of get. Like both of my grandmothers fell asleep in movie theaters at that age, I can kind of get. But when you're young, I don't get it. Now, as you can tell from how I've been talking about this film, it does come with my recommendation, especially if you are a big fan of slasher films. Now, if you don't like it because of the experimental nature of it, the long takes, I can get it. I would love to hear like a little bit more elaboration on why, but that's what the open dialogue about film is. When this film does come out on video, I do plan on getting it. Depending on how long the theatrical run is, I might see it a second time, just see how it plays a second time. It's definitely one of those ones that I look forward to revisiting it. And if these guys are ever at like a horror con, I'd actually like to have a conversation with them, especially like Nash, like asking like, so what inspired like some things like this, or even meeting the character who played Johnny, that's Ryan Barrett. I'd be interested to like see like what was his approach to it, because since we're following him for the most part, he's got a lot of moments where he's got to act a certain way, especially for close-ups, like when we see the killer unmasked for the first time. Well, that's really all I have to say about this film, so until next time, everybody.